Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Stanley. I will be your moderator for tonight, and we will be addressing and discussing the legacy of Emmett Till, as this is the 65th anniversary. So, would everyone like to start off by introducing themselves?
Yes, my name is Marquise Hunt. I'm a senior at Tougaloo College, and I am honored to be here with you guys this evening.
Awesome. Brianna, Macy?
My sound is kind of messing up. Sorry, I can't hear y'all. It's real crazy on this side. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Um, Introductions. I'm Brianna Simone Reeves. I am the Virginia State Conference NAACP Youth and College Division Vice President and the University of Mary Washington NAACP President. It is a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And Maisie?
Can you guys hear me? Because I can't hear any of y'all.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can't hear anything whatsoever. But I'm assuming that you guys are introducing yourselves.
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Macy Brown. I am a freshman at the illustrious North Carolina A&T State University, Aggie Pride. And I guess they call me an organizer, an activist, and me along with 3 other students organized one of the largest protests we've had in Mississippi since the 1960s over the summer. And so I've been kind of doing some activist work over the years with that. We organized the protest, just, really involved in the community. And I aspire to work in education policy.
That's awesome. And I am Grace Stanley. As I said before, I will be the moderator for tonight. I am a senior at West Florida High School in Pensacola, Florida. And I have known Miss Deborah Till for a while. And I'm just excited to... Oh no, she can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to start off by asking a few questions. Just what was your initial reaction learning about Emmett Till? When did you first learn about Emmett Till?
I'll start first. When I first heard about Emmett Till, I might have been a freshman in high school, and I was in history class, of course. And of course, one of the things that struck me now, after being able to have the opportunity to live in the state of Mississippi, to connect with relatives of Emmett Till, and also, a number of civil rights veterans and activists across the state, is that the story that I was told about Emmett Till in high school was not necessarily 100% true, and that's a direct reflection of a number of stories that we hear being told in our public school systems about things that happen to Black and brown folks across this country at the hands of white supremacy, racism, and bigotry. And so when I heard about Emmett Till, of course, it was told to me that he was killed for whistling at a white woman, and we for most of us know the story from there. And so when I got to Mississippi, I was able to connect with Dr. Adelia Carthen, who's a professor at Tougaloo College, and eventually Deborah Watts, who is the co-founder of the Emmett Till Legacy Foundation, and was really able to hear more about the legacy of Emmett Till, they being relatives of Emmett Till, who lost his life. You know, he was murdered. He was assassinated at the age of 14 for whistling at a white woman. And, you know, when I think about the things that have happened in the 21st century, things that I'm able to distinctly recognize with the killings of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, and just recently with the attempted murder of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, it's a direct reflection of what it is that we're seeing across the country, and a direct reflection of the hate that we have seen being spewed by white people in America. And so that is where I first heard the story of Emmett Till, was when I was in high school.
I believe mine was a bit earlier. I believe I found out in middle school. I don't believe I was taught it by any means, right? Especially not in a history class based off America's public school education. I believe my mom might have mentioned his name, and I looked it up on my own. And to see the pictures at that young age, right? To see the pictures at 12, 13, what happened to a young Black boy at 14, right? For whistling at a white woman. Getting that image early on, seeing the before and after picture, hearing the story, and doing the research that early on as a preteen, the impact that had was very traumatic, right? And even today, right, imagining how traumatic that is or was for his mother and for his descendants and his family today. And I, just in terms of just how traumatic it was, right? At least for me, I wanted to know why, first of all, it happened in the first place. And if I'm reading about it now and nobody has been arrested, this had to be, if I'm in middle school, about 2011, 2012. Nobody's been arrested for this many years, right? Somebody lied. So trying to connect the pieces that early on as a young Black person in America, a young Black woman in America, that this happened decades before me. And then I'm still living in a system that is allowing or has allowed for murderers like this to walk around, that does something to one's mental, especially Black youth. And so since then, and then witnessing or hearing about Trayvon Martin, and then having to live through Mike Brown and Sandra Bland and Philando Castile and Freddie Gray, that ingrains a different type of spirit in you. I just say to keep showing up, but also to keep fighting, because what happened to Emmett Till continues to happen today. So I believe that was really my first reaction. It was just traumatizing. And to see that constantly happen to our young Black men, our Black family members, you know, it's still traumatizing, and it still gives more of an incentive to keep showing up. But I don't believe it should take that to show up for Black people, or it should take a murder like that, or it should take an Emmett Till to show up for the Black liberation. So
I absolutely agree. When did you first learn about Emmett Till, Maisie?
Okay, hey y'all. I think I'm back now.
Great.
I first learned about Emmett Till. So my aunt works with Mississippi Center for Justice. And every other year, they do like a civil rights road trip with people who travel from all over the country, trying to, learn about Mississippi civil rights history. And so I think I went on a trip with her, and that was like my first time actually learning, who he was, what happened, and why it was so important for the movement, because that's not really something we talked about in schools, especially at that age, I guess because of the brutality of it. But I think that it's actually more important to talk with the younger kids about it, since he was so close to their age. And that was kind of my first encounter with it.
Well, I started off, we've always done history in my house. We've always learned history, been very aware of African American history, because that's just something that my mother made sure very early on to make sure that we knew. So I researched and performed the story of Emmett Till, his life and his legacy for, I believe it was 6th grade history fair, and then just continued on with history fair for quite a while, just sharing lesser known African American stories that I felt needed to be heard and needed to be shared. Great, we will do that for you, Brianna. So the next question, more recently, what lessons should youth today learn, do you think, from the murder of Emmett Till? What do you think youth today can take away from that?
I think is this for everybody or for specific people? Okay.
Yeah.
I think for me, kids now realize that they don't have to do anything but be Black in order to be killed. And I think that, Emmett Till's murder was kind of our first, or like one of the most, well, it wasn't the first, happening of just being Black and being killed, but I think for him to be so young, so innocent, and for people to sympathize with that, it just goes to show you that your Blackness, whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're skinny, whether you're tall, short, whatever it is, your Blackness is enough for you to be a threat, for you to be seen as a weapon. And I think that now in today's time, when we see so many Black men, running, exercising, when you see Black women sleeping in their bed, when you see these different things of just being Black, just existing and being killed, I think that young people are almost becoming desensitized to it because that's so much of what our social commentary is about.
I agree, absolutely.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say I agree 100% as well. I think that the other thing too, for me, which is so triggering, is that Emmett Till was 14 years old, a child, a young boy who I'm sure had a number of plans and aspirations to live up to, a number of dreams and goals and visions that his life was never able to meet simply because folks who had so much hate decided to take his young life because he whistled at a white woman. And so when we think about, as Macy said, that it doesn't matter how young or old you are, that you could still be a subject and a victim of this type of action across the country. I think too, another thing for me is that just the way everything went, like for me, how everything went down with the story of Emmett Till is just is mind blowing to me. I think when you think about the fact that he was staying with his uncle Mose Wright in Mississippi, had just traveled there. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, really not wanting him to leave Chicago to go visit Mississippi, knowing the history and knowing what could possibly happen, and yet her son being a victim of that same story that she told her son to be cautious and careful of, not knowing that he would be one to experience that at 14 years old. But then to know that 65 years later, that same justice system that we often talk about is the same justice system that failed the family of Emmett Till and failed Emmett Till when it came to bringing him justice, when it was very clear and apparent that the gentlemen who were involved and the other accomplices who were involved were guilty of the crime that they committed of the lynching of Emmett Till. And yet, even when Mose Wright pointed in the courtroom that those were the men who did that to his nephew, they were still found innocent. And then, yet after they were found innocent and found not guilty of the crime, they admitted to it. And of course, there was nothing that the justice system could do simply because of laws that some white folks in America have made when it comes to not trying cases more than once when new evidence comes. So the justice system has failed Emmett Till, and I think the justice system, especially the civil rights division of our justice system, has failed a number of families across the country when it comes to the killings of unarmed Black men and women. And so I think the number one lesson is to make sure that young folks really understand what role our justice system plays and making sure that Black and brown people don't get justice in America.
Blackness in itself is
Yeah, I think both of you hit on really good points. I think the first thing that they should learn is that it shouldn't take a murder, right? This explicit, it shouldn't take a murder, period, of a Black young boy or a Black person, period, for you to have to understand who you are, right? It shouldn't take a traumatic event to pull you into your identity, right? You should be able to walk that truth and not be affected negatively or be murdered for it. So I think that's one of the main things. But I think another point, and you kind of hit on it, was that respectability politics that I feel like comes up a lot in the movement, right? But it doesn't matter what clothes you have on, if you have on a suit, a 2-piece, 3-piece, 4-piece, 5-piece, 6-piece suit, if you have on a bow tie, if you have on a collar shirt, if you running around in a white beater, it shouldn't matter what you have on. It's your Blackness. And you can't get rid of that. And especially growing up in a predominantly white community, I saw a lot of young Black men be coddled by white America. And then once they reach a certain age, now they're a criminal. And so they never realized that it was all at the beginning always about their Blackness and never about their personhood. And so when it comes down to now, I think it's important that the youth know it can happen at any time to any of you. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO or the janitor of a building or a corporation or whatever. It's your Blackness, and you have to be cognizant of your history, of your identity. Don't expect a system that has constantly taken it away from your people and from your ancestors to try and give you your history or give you your identity back. It's yours, right? So fully engaging in your identity so you don't let white America tell you who you should be, and start walking in that truth and realizing that if all of us ain't free, then none of us are free, right? And that we have to keep showing up for one another, because what happened to Emmett Till can happen to any of us and has happened to many of us today.
I think another really large part of this story that I think Marquise touched on was the fact that he was from Chicago. He did live in Chicago, and this was just supposed to be a family trip. So in Chicago, his Blackness wasn't the same level of threat. There weren't the same level of consequences that he faced for his Blackness in Chicago that he did, which led to his inevitable death in Money, Mississippi, which is what his mother tried to warn him of, but he was 14 years old. There's only so much that you can say to someone to try to protect them. But my next question is, what was it, do you think, about the Till murder that sparked the modern civil rights movement, and how can our current losses of people such as Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and still he is a catalyst, Jacob Blake more recently, thankfully he is alive, how can they serve as a similar catalyst for us?
I think more so with the Emmett Till case, his mother's decision to, publish the picture from the funeral. I think that if she had not, we may not be where we are today. I think that that's a really pivotal moment that often goes overlooked sometimes and isn't really credited enough for why we are where we are today. I think that no matter how, and this could be argued, no matter how hateful people are or how fed that really push at people's heartstrings or that really push people to change. And so I think just the fact that he was a child, the fact that he was unrecognizable in his casket, really just kind of was a moment for people to just be like, okay, now what? Because how many more pictures do we want to see, published in magazines? And I think now, I don't think we need to use the people. I don't think there's like a need for the people now to be catalysts, because I feel like they already are. Like, young people are already mobilizing. The protests are already happened. People are already coming together. And so for us, we're becoming slightly desensitized to it just because it seems like there is a name every other day. But I mean, we can look at the George Floyd. Why was that such a big thing for us? Because first of all, we're already in quarantine. We're already, we're alone with our feelings, with our thoughts. Everybody's already, isolated. And then you saw the video. You saw the 8-minute, 46-second video, and you heard the sound, and you heard him saying, and so people are evoked by their senses. And so I think that that's, why we are where we are today.
I think we have so many catalysts because it was Trayvon Martin, and that was the amount of protests and riots that happened with the Stand Your Ground laws after the murder of Trayvon Martin were national. But then with the George Floyd murder, it sparked another conversation about police brutality, and those protests and riots were international. So I feel like with every loss that we see as a community, as a race of humanity, it just sparks another catalyst. But how many catalysts can we have until there's no more reaction?
I think for me, I'll piggyback off of what Macy said. Of course, the decision for Mamie Till Mobley to say that I want the world to see what they did to my boy was such a powerful move, simply because now we are often met with the visual representation of what happened in the process. And of course, we weren't able to see visually what they did to Emmett Till, how they did it. But yet, when it comes to police brutality in America, as Macy alluded to, we've become desensitized to it simply because it's something that we're often seeing. One of the things that I said a couple of months ago is that our television shows have become episodes of police brutality, and we just changed the episode with the name of a Black person in America. So episode 1 might be Emmett Till, and episode 30 might be the attempted murder of Jacob Blake. And that's something that we've been faced with and forced to watch in this country. And I think that it's so important for us to recognize that young people have always been at the forefront of every movement in this country. And I think one of the things that all of us here can agree is that whatever civil rights veteran or activist that we've been able to meet, they've continued to encourage us to make sure that we, didn't let the torch of justice to lose its flame. And so I think that's why it's so important for us to make sure that we're continuing to organize and mobilize young folks, but also making sure that we're continuing to educate ourselves in the process, because I think there's so many cracks to false information out there to where we can easily slip into and be misguided when it comes to this fight for justice. I think it's so easy for us to get distracted and tainted with information that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with our real purpose and cause for the movement. And so I think education again is something that's so important for us to make sure that we are giving ourselves and the due diligence that we give to other folks who we are continuing to ask to get out and vote at the end of the day. In the midst of everything, that's really the number one goal, to make sure that we can have sustainable change through policy and legislation and have the right individuals to represent us, and also hold them accountable in the process. Grace, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Filmmaker Keith Beauchamp said Emmett Till is Anne Frank to Black America. Do you agree? Why or why not? As Anne Frank would be kind of like an Emmett Till for Jewish Americans.
just quick question. I would personally say no, right?
Mhm.
I don't necessarily favor the question because I don't, and I'm a little bugged with history, but I don't think that Anne Frank was, shot and thrown into a lake and pulled. I just,
She was a
I just
survivor.
think that
Sorry.
right,
Well,
and that totally makes sense. But Emmett Till didn't survive. I'm just,
Exactly.
I'm a little indifferent to the question. That's all I want to say.
well, I mean, so Anne Frank she died.
Yes. Yes.
She wasn't a survivor. Her and her sister died in a concentration camp. Believe it was of sickness, but I mean, many people around them were shot like animals and thrown into. I mean, a lot of concentration camps, like they were in Poland and different parts of Europe, were very brutal. And people were mutilated and everything else. But I wouldn't make the comparison just because, and I wouldn't make the comparison simply because of what has happened after the fact. So if we look at Nazi Germany as a whole, Nazi Germany has already been condemned. They brought those people to justice for their crimes. They don't fly the swastika. That's something that everybody agrees is bad. They got, it's cool. Like, I think Germany as a whole has just been like, that was bad. America hasn't done the same. So it's not really of the same thing. I feel like to an extent, anti-Semitism is still a very relevant issue, and Jewish people still, there's still a lot of issues with that. But at least their like pain has been like acknowledged and it's been like validated. And we look at the Republican National Convention this week and they get on there and say America is not racist. And so I think when you have just the differences in the follow-up of how that's happened, you really can't compare the two. And though she was kept in this situation and died because of her religion, Emmett Till died because of, the color of his skin, and he was still a child. And, so I think there are like small physical, literal comparisons you can make to situations, but the actual like situation, I don't even want to involve the Holocaust and the civil rights in the same time. Like, I don't even want, those are two separate entities to me. The historian in me, that's two separate entities.
I think your point is brilliant. I love your point. Your point. I like your point. Marquise, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Macy hit it right on the head for all of us. So I agree 100%.
Awesome. We recently lost a powerful civil rights leader, Congressman John Lewis, and he stated, Emmett Till was my George Floyd. Given what we saw after George Floyd's movement, what does that say to you today, your hope for our future?
Can you repeat the question? Just to make sure I heard you right. I wasn't quite sure like what you were asking.
Okay, absolutely. We recently lost a powerful civil rights leader, icon, Congressman John Lewis, and he stated, and I quote, Emmett Till was my George Floyd. Given what we saw after George Floyd's murder, what does that say to you about today, and does that provide hope for you for the future?
Personally, I would have to say no. Well, I'm gonna kind of ride the fence for a second. I think that after George Floyd, we saw the mobilization of not just Black people, but people of all colors, creeds, races come together and like condemn what happened. And like a lot of people could easily agree to like, hey, this is wrong. But though the people agreed, that this was wrong. The general public, the people in power, did not act swiftly. They did not act willingly. And we had to burn cities down, and we had to block traffic, and we had to make noise for them to do something. So, in a nutshell, it may seem like, hey, hope, like they arrested them, but why did it have to take all of that? So it's like they're kind of giving you crumbs of like, be hopeful. They're giving you crumbs of, what this could be, but it shouldn't have to take all of that. It shouldn't have to take all of that. And so I think that it signals that, okay, the people are in order to an extent. The people can collectively agree that this is wrong, but it's not translating to those who actually make the decision. And I think that's our biggest problem right now. It's not moving up like it's supposed to. So I think that's kind of my biggest takeaway.
This might follow me for the rest of my life, what I'm about to say, and I'll stand by it when I'm 60 and 70 years old. But one of the things that I think happens, or that we do subconsciously and sometimes consciously, is that we have these sayings with no real meaning. And we have these sayings, just for formality to make people feel good. And I think telling folks just to have hope is one of those sayings. And I think, well, one of the things that I was taught is that when you think about it, just having hope will get you absolutely nowhere. There's work that has to come behind that hope. There are boots on the ground that are needed to have that kind of hope. There are having the right people in power and in position to make decisions to have that kind of hope. And I think that when it comes to everything that has happened across the country, hope has failed us because we don't have the follow-up of what it is that we exactly need in our communities to make sure that we do have hope. And I think some of us find ourselves hopeless when we have people who, like Macy said, do not act swiftly. And one of those individuals could be called, and that's, Daniel Cameron, who is the Attorney General of Kentucky, who is a Black man. And like Michael Eric Dyson once said, who's a professor at Georgetown University, is that white supremacy has no preference for skin. And we've seen that all across the country, where yet Brianna Taylor was sleeping. She was also on the front lines in the midst of this very real pandemic and was shot and killed in her home, and yet laid on the ground for at least 10 minutes without no help. And so when we think about how it's been over 150 days, and yet the officers who killed Brianna Taylor, those who also conspired when it came to the police report of Brianna Taylor, have not been arrested. They have not been charged, but yet Daniel Cameron can go at the Republican National Convention and give words. And I think no one can do that. And me personally, that doesn't give me hope. And so I think that it's important for us to make sure that there are people in different spheres and in different areas who are doing some of the same work, but are doing so many different things that are impactful to this movement. And so for Macy, for example, you've seen her in Mississippi, who was one of the leaders for one of the largest protests since the 1960s. And we see Brianna, who is also doing work in Virginia and doing work around policy and holding discussions. And so I think that when we talk about what our role is in this movement, it looks different. Although we're all Black, I think that we can all go to the streets and protest. But one of the things that I say is that in order for us to get justice, and if we want to include justice and hope in that conversation, is that we have to have both activism and advocacy. They both go hand in hand. And I think that that's a conversation that we really need to continue to have. And so I think that once we really make sure that we understand our role and responsibility in this moment, and in this movement, that we can start to really identify what hope looks like when we have the follow-up to get that and gain that hope.
Marquise, that was both of you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, for me, what gives me hope is the people, right? And both of y'all kind of hit on it, but the people that are doing the work, the people that are waking up, the people that are activating and moving and mobilizing and organizing, although they've had no experience, they want to hit the streets and they want people to hear their voices, and they're ready to do whatever it takes to do that. That's what gives me hope. People having tough conversations, people holding their white friends or so-called friends accountable for racism and microaggressions and their beliefs that discard their Blackness. That's what gives me hope. I don't think ignoring it gives me hope. Trying to put in another name to replace somebody that was a Black person that was murdered doesn't give me hope. It's seeing the people move and seeing people not just talk about it, actually be about it for the long term, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's in the news and when it's trending on Facebook, but in the long run, being in uncomfortable spaces, having uncomfortable conversations, and being able to understand that it's been happening, and either we're going to be the change or we're going to have to be passing the torch on to somebody else to do what we should have been done. So yeah.
I definitely agree with Brianna because I believe that it's times like now, because June was full of protests. Black Lives Matter was the trending topic on Twitter. Breonna Taylor, hashtag Breonna Taylor, hashtag George Floyd, all of the hashtags, all of the protests, it was the social media train. It was trendy to be an activist for some reason, because celebrities started talking more about it and things like that. But it's times like now, after it's not a trending topic, that people are still having discussions, and that is what necessarily, like she said, it's the people that are still talking about it, that are still keeping the subject relevant and still talking and keeping their peers accountable. That is what gives me, quote unquote, some level of hope, some level of thinking that something eventually is going to change. Because if it's not the elected officials, and I will talk about that in a second, if it's not the elected officials, it has to be the people in the communities, in the cities that are enacting change that they can control. If they can start these conversations with the people that they are surrounded by, they can also change minds and let people know their biases, their preconceived notions, all of these things, and start to unravel them so that everybody can then unlearn and relearn history correctly and come to their own conclusions their own way. So now let's talk about activism, because I think it was, as Marquise said, there is work that needs to be done, or maybe it was Macy, I'm sorry. But there is the work that needs to be done and boots that need to be on the ground, and it is the end of August. As you said, it was the Republican National Convention, and before that, the Democratic National Convention, I believe. So voting is coming up soon. And not only the presidential election, but also more local elections. So how are you all sharing the word about youth voting? Because youth need to vote. There were a lot of youth last presidential election that did not vote. So how are you spreading the word of registering to vote and making sure that you go out to the polls or you get your ballot and you mail it in?
So great you asked that. Actually working with 3 other young people, Ariel Hudson, Jarius Adams, and Jordan Jefferson, some of you may be familiar with. And we kind of create like a coalition of young people in Mississippi called Young Mississippians for Voting. And our whole objective is to get people to the polls in November. Just to ask, hey, are you registered? Hey, get 5 people and ask them, are they registered? Then those 5 people ask more 5 people, like, are you registered? Like putting out, when we're in the works of trying to put out voter education materials. Like if you're a felon, checking to see if your felony is even disenfranchising. Some people think just because I'm a felon, I can't vote. That's not true. It's only 23 of them. And so I think that, you know, forming these groups and coalitions and connections of young people, and just encouraging them to go out and just looking at our current situation, like, do you want this for another 4 years? We're in the midst of a pandemic that we did not have to be in for this long. People are getting evicted from their homes because they're jobless. Unemployment benefits have gone back down to nothing. People are waiting on $1,200 checks because they aren't getting checks from any other source. Black people are being killed. I mean, black people are being killed on television for sport. Just looking at now, it's just like we all complain. This all sucks. It sucks to be black in America right now. So it's just like, are you gonna do something about it, or are we just gonna keep tweeting our complaints? And so I also think that it's important to realize that activism looks different for different people. Activism is not always marching. Activism is not always protesting. Activism is not always calling your legislators. Activism comes in the form of art. Activism comes in the form of speaking. Activism comes in the form of conversations. And so I think everything works hand in hand. So we have to kind of get out the idea that activists look a certain way, that activism is a certain thing, and realize that if we all contribute in our respective mediums, then we can create even bigger movements.
I'm really glad that you said that, right? Because I think many people do, and that's why repost activism in May and June was so easy to do. Because everybody thought, oh, well, if I repost this, I sign this petition, I call this legislator, I put Black Lives Matter in my bio and post this little black squirrel on Instagram, I'm an activist, right? And so you have people that are trying to jump into all these different lanes, but don't realize that they have a certain gift, they have a certain voice wherever they are to be an activist, right? And that doesn't look one way. And as soon as we start boxing in a way to contribute to the movement, you start losing momentum and you start losing more people who can contribute but feel like they can't do it in this one way. So that's a really good point. I think in terms of voting, right, being involved with the Virginia State Conference, NAACP, the college division, doing things statewide. We have a VA voting initiative that we're working on to get a lot of campuses and universities and things of that nature educated about voting, pulling on those resources. But I think what I've done, and it's a little on the different side in getting turnout, but it's watching my approach. And I think so many times you don't turn people off. People aren't against registering. People aren't against voting. They're against how you approach them about it, right? And so watching my approach, right? We can say it's a right all day. So if it was a right, then all of us should have felons shouldn't have to go back and re-register, or shouldn't have to fight for that, right? So it's definitely a privilege though. And I think delivery is so important, especially when you're trying to turn out people who never came out before. You're trying to instill hope, as we earlier talked about, in people who don't have a hope in the system, right? Black people are tired. And so you have to be strategic about that approach. You don't want to condemn your Black brother or sister or family member for not having faith in the system, right? So therefore the approach has to be, okay, I know you don't have faith in the system, but we're going to use this as a vehicle to get a little bit closer to where we need to go, right? I know you may not like this, but you passionate about criminal justice, and this person is up for election and they right alongside with your beliefs, right? I need you to come out with me. And also being consistent in that pursuit. A lot of us, I see a lot of folks get on Facebook or social media, say, y'all need to vote, and then never hit nobody up, never organize anything in their hometown, never look at the voter turnout, never educate the youth early on, right? Like, don't just wait until Black kids or Black youth is 18 to teach them about voting and the power of voting, but also teaching them to be activists and to organize and mobilize and turn out outside of voting as well. That way voting doesn't seem like this big thing. It starts seeming like something I just do, right? The same way I show up to protest is the same way I cast my vote. So I think the approach for me personally has been so much more impactful in terms of getting folks to turn out, right? Being willing to have those tough conversations where people say they're not going to turn out, and committing myself to having a conversation to sympathize with how they're feeling, and then to kind of bring them on board, right? And it takes a consistent, being very consistent and talking to them and engaging with them, but it also takes hearing their concerns and sympathizing with their concerns as a Black person in America, and still saying that even if you don't vote, I'm gonna make sure I vote. And once you start, I believe once you start moving like that, people will come along, especially if you're constantly there as a resource to educate them and to get them on board.
Yeah, and just like a quick plug to what she was saying, I kind of have to talk to people how I talk to my 7 and 8 year olds. I used to work at the Boys and Girls Club, and anytime I had a meltdown or a tantrum or issue, I'm just like, okay, they're like, I'm angry, or they made me mad, or some of the I had 7-year-olds tell me they pissed me off, and I'm just like, okay, why do you feel this way? How can we work through this? Who was involved? Let's fix this. Let's mediate it. Can you apologize? And so when people are just like, I don't know, instead of just being like, shame, like, boo you don't vote. You're part of the problem. No voting is a vote for Trump, which is true. You kind of have to treat people like 7 and 8 year olds sometimes and just be like, well, why don't you vote? Let's talk through that. Let's workshop through that and let's see what we can do to change your mind. And so I think, like Brianna was saying, if we change our approach instead of just being, just, and kind of, we have to start treating people like elementary school kids. I swear, it works. It works.
I think what Brianna said earlier about finding something that the person that you know is passionate about and starting from there is so key, because you can't force somebody to care about something that they just genuinely aren't interested in. But if you know that they're passionate about something and you can get them started, you can get a foot in the door that is almost closed. Just like she said, criminal justice. Well, there's legislators, there's all of these elections. You can get them involved some way, somehow. Just broadening their span, easing in something that they're interested in that would not only help them, but affect change in the community. I think that's a great point.
One of the things that I want to add is that I think it's also important to note that the work doesn't just stop after November. And I think that that's often times where folks kind of believe it or not, drop the ball when it comes to this whole process. We often talk about the political process, but the political process is ever rolling. And I think that we have to successfully connect the dots in order for it to look like how we say we want it to look like. And that, comes with holding our elected officials accountable. And I think oftentimes, and I know I was going to say this in the discussion a while ago, is that one of the things that is somewhat interesting to me is that when Black folks sometimes try and hold other Black folks in office accountable, it's looked at as tearing down your own community. But the reality of it is, we should be holding ourselves accountable more than anybody else. And so I think that it's important for us to make sure that if we are electing people to represent us. And we often say that representation matters. And I know that for those who are young and elder, the lessons that our mothers and grandmothers taught us is that the people you involve yourself around are a direct reflection of who you are. And that's the same thing with our political system. So if we are allowing other folks to get in office who are not a direct reflection of who we are and what our community looks like, then we need to make sure that we are showing up even 10 times more to the polls in November, and not just for the presidential election, but for school board, city council, and I know in other places they have, different positions that hold different authority. But I think that it's important to make sure that we are ever present in every single election, because if we don't have anybody who is genuinely interested in the well-being of our community, then we not only will see our community suffer, but we will be the reason essentially as to why our communities aren't getting what it is that they need. And so we need to make sure that we are understanding of what this political system looks like, and that we understand our role in it way after we cast our vote in November. And so holding our elected officials accountable, attending the meetings, and even if we don't know what's actually going to be talked about at a city council meeting or school board meeting, there were people who once sat in those seats or sat in the chambers and stood behind the podium to speak, and not had one student or one child in the public school system, but knew how important it was to make sure that the students and the children in their community had quality education. Same thing with our city council. When you know that there are folks who are doing what's necessarily right, and to make sure that we have the necessary resources and tools in order for us to have a successful and thriving community, then folks sometimes who don't even live in your city might end up showing up. And folks who might have moved out of your city might end up coming back and making sure that they understand the importance of making sure that we continue this effort. And so I think that there's so much work to be done far after November.
The fact that politics is just a great point that I think that you raised, because people aren't necessarily as vocal of all of their local elections as they should be, when those are the ones that are affecting their day-to-day lives just as much, if not more, than the presidential elections every 4 years. I have another question, this time not political, but back to catalysts. What was your catalyst? What was your turning point? What was your trigger? Or has justice and racial equality always been a focal point in your childhood and household?
I guess I could start if no one else is wanting to start. 2015, I was home in Portsmouth, Virginia, and it came across the screen breaking news that a young 18-year-old boy was shot and killed in a local Walmart parking lot in my city by a police officer. And the storyline is a storyline that is often pinned on Black and brown folks. That's not necessarily true. Is that he was accused of stealing something at the Walmart, was ended up being followed by police, Walmart security, and when he made it to the parking lot, was met by a white 20-something-year-old officer by the name of Stephen Rankin, who said that he was intimidated by William Chapman simply because of his size, because he was much larger than Stephen Rankin was, and shot him in the head and in the chest several times, and he lay dead in the Walmart parking lot. And I think that in the midst of everything else that I saw, whether that had been a number of Black and brown people who were being killed at the hands of law enforcement, here it was, a young person in my city, where I lived, where I grew up, where I went to school, and where I, gained community, was shot and killed. And so it was my responsibility then to not only just protest, but to be engaged in this process from the beginning to the very end. And so that looked like protesting and being engaged with the city council meetings, talking to the police chief, the Commonwealth attorney, city manager, the list went on and on. And that really taught me how to really be engaged in what the process looks like and who to go to when things like this do happen. And so that was my start for really a spark of interest when it comes to my responsibility. And ever since that day in 2015, I've been duty bound to show up. You don't necessarily have to ask me twice, nor do you have to ask me once to show up when something is happening to a Black and brown person in my community.
I think for me, my biggest catalyst or trigger for my social justice was the state flag. And I kind of tell this story a lot and a lot of different issues and like a lot of different like stories and stuff about like in my Algebra 1 class, we had the assignment of like designing a new state flag. And my 14-year-old self was just like, what's wrong with the old state flag? And going and doing research around what that was, why that was an issue. And when I realized that symbols like that could fly, and it seemed like not many people cared or were bothered by that, that really bothered me.
And what city are you in again,
and so that,
Macy?
Jackson.
Okay.
Jackson, yeah. And so learning about that and learning and trying to figure out why more people weren't outraged about that I didn't know, kind of propelled me to want to be a part of that change.
Okay. Okay. No, yep.
Were you
Please
gonna say something, Grace?
No, I was just saying.
I believe for me it was right. Obviously, Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown was a lot. I think what really did it was Sandra Bland. Seeing a Black woman, right? Somebody that looked like me, somebody that looked like my mother, my aunt, watching the and it was kind of hit on earlier, right? Watching it does something different. Seeing the pictures does something different. And so seeing her, just casually, well, first seeing that video, especially comes out, especially during this time, of her speaking about Black Lives Matter and what it means. Seeing somebody who was so vocal, right? Somebody like me, Black woman, driving, gets pulled over, and something that says, no, I'm not putting my cigarette out. That gets her yanked out her car, gets her punched in her face, dragged across the asphalt, thrown onto the ground, right? Strangled. Like, you're watching this entire situation happen. And then a few days later, she ends up having committed suicide, right? Following that. And I can't explain why. I don't know why. I feel like I have this connection to Sandra Bland. I believe it might be because I see me and herself. But seeing it happen was just heartbreaking. Seeing it happen with Trayvon and everybody, always heartbreaking. But Sandra Bland, I think, hit home for me because I felt like I was watching what could happen to myself. And then to see the Say Her Name campaign even have to happen because people aren't saying this Black woman's name who got murdered, whose case hasn't really been covered, who hasn't received justice. To see you have to say her name, that it was just sickening to me, right? That you would have to say my name, that we still have to say Breonna Taylor's name, right? Tatiana Jefferson, that we still have to say these young Black women's names. And don't get me started on Black trans women, right? That we have to keep saying their names because people seem to forget. And that also goes with just thinking that Black women are so strong and that nothing happens to them. But I think Sandra Bland really sparked I was already smart mouth, but it sparked it like times two. It sparked the arguments in classrooms. It sparked, my questioning of this feminist movement that I didn't feel like was reflective of Black women and didn't speak out for Black women as much as they said they were for women. I believe Sandra Bland started all of it. So that's when I started being a proud, unapologetic, loud Black woman, but then also adopting the characteristics of I'm strong, I'm gentle, things of nature, because America especially has gone out of its way to dehumanize Black women. So
That's awesome. We have 3 minutes left, well, a little bit less than 3 minutes left. So I would first like to thank you for all of your statements. I've very much enjoyed being on this panel. I feel like we covered a lot. So my last question is, and then you can share your closing remarks. It has been 65 years. Do you think there could be justice for Emmett Till? What would it look like?
I think we need to arrest Carolyn Bryant. She's still alive and living well, wherever she might be across the country. She was the reason why Emmett Till lost his life because she was, for some reason, afraid of his black skin and a whistle that might have sounded like beautiful music outside of the grocery store that they invited folks to come in and shop at. And so I think that Carolyn Bryant needs to be arrested just as the justice system continues to arrest Black and brown folks who are of elderly age for crimes that they commit or allegedly committed years ago. And so I think that it's important to make sure that the first step is to make sure that we recognize what that justice looks like and that charges should still be brought towards Carolyn Bryant and that she should be arrested.
Incredible.
Exactly. I'm going to co-sign on what Marquis said. I think he covered it as far as justice for Emmett Till, and I think that we covered a lot, what we think our next step should be as far as direct action. And I'm really thankful to have been here with y'all tonight.
Thank you. Do you have any last words, Brianna?
yeah, literally what Marquis said. I think it's especially important also that America does not get to determine what justice looks like, and that the family and of Emmett Till gets to determine that. America has a way of hurting Black folks and then telling you what feeling. And I think that they should have full jurisdiction on what that justice looks like, what reconciliation and healing looks like, because I know they're still mourning. So, and I'm grateful to have been here with you all as well.
I am so thankful for this panel. Thank you to everybody who spoke. Thank you to Marquise. Thank you to Brianna. Thank you to Macy.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.